So now we discuss another important aspect of Android Fragments, of Android Studio or Android development called Fragments. Actually, Fragments you can also make an app which does not use Fragments at all. Fragments can also be avoided in some kind of apps, especially in the simpler apps. Actually, Fragments came. This concept of Fragments came after I think Android 11, the release 11, I think it came, and the in fact, 11 is the API. The API is 11, so I must delete this. So sorry, the API level is 11. API level is 11 when the Android came. Sorry, the Android fragments came, and the Android release was 3.0. So uh, at this point, from this release, Android release 3.0, came the fragment concept in the Android Studio. What actually is the fragment concept? Fragment concept is, for example, like we discussed in the case of activities, that activity is kind of a single functionality for the user in a screen, or it has a UI. So in the case of, actually, fragment was mainly designed in the case of bigger screens, for example tablets, etc. And the concept behind the fragment was that in a way to divide the screen into multiple components, each component having a certain functionality, such sub activities, and each of these child you know these child components of this main parent activity can have a separate UI, and a separate functionality, to kind of support a complete separate functionality. So that's why the fragment came. The fragments are kind of very similar to activities then, and they are, for example, contained inside a single activity, and they have, for example, these F1, F2, F3, and F4 fragment. They have like an activity, for example, a layout.xml file. They have all those four states that an activity has. This like start or resume, stop. These states, and this on create or on create view. These creation functions as well, just like the activities, quite similar to the activities. And that's actually, the you can say, the basic concept of the fragments. So we can just give a small example. Let's say on the top of this activity are some tabs, say 1, 2, 3, 4. So if the user clicks the tab 1, this F1 will be F1 fragment will will become visible in the whole activity, like this. And if the user clicks 2, then the F2 fragment will be visible in the activity. Just like for example, a calling app. In a calling app, for example, you can have an activity to make a call or SMS, and this activity can have, for example, two fragments. One is call and one is SMS. This has, say, 1, 2, 3, like 9, 10 numbers, and then two buttons, for example call and a button like S. And if the user for example presses call, this a new fragment is called, and then this call progress is shown. And if the user clicks, say for example, on the button S, then this activity is occupied by a second fragment, which will be sending the SMS, right? Like you have a message part here, you have a send SMS part here, send SMS part here. Like this will be, if the user is, for example, SMS tab is active, we can say like this: if the SMS tab is active, then this will come. If the calling is active, then this fragment will be on the top of the will be covering the activity. So this is how you can use the fragment. So you can also reuse these fragment in different activities. For example, you can have in the case of a calling app, you can have a third fragment, which is for example a call, a contact. So the contact fragment can be visible from other activities as well, because it is quite usual to activities. So you can also have more than one fragment visible in the activity at the same time. Say, for example, we have a tablet screen. Say it's a big tablet screen. It will be easier to explain because it's big, and you can also have this thing in a phone. And say, for example, you have a fragment F1 here, which contains F1 here, which contains a list. You can show the list like this. We have a list here, and then you have, for example, a fragment F2, and then you have a third fragment F3. Say F3 is showing some description, say some text. It's just showing some text. So, and for example, this list view has certain entries, and say this has some, for example, this fragment has maybe some buttons, B1, B2, or say for further details. You can say for further details, or anything. So for example, if we click, let's use this color, not this one, blue. So if we click, for example, this entry inside the fragment, this entry, it's yellow. So you click this entry. As soon as we click this entry, then, for example, the contents of this fragment F3 change, and so we get a description of this. Maybe, for example, is the information of this is the selection of different parts in a car. So, for example, brakes. So this is a description of all the brakes, what kind of brakes are there in the cars, and all those things, and what are the new technologies in brakes and things like this. Now, if we, for example, click say B1, we can add a functionality that any page that is visible here, we can go to the further details of this, for example, a more description or something, or maybe to go to the next page of this fragment, anything. So something like this. This is called more than one fragments in one screen. And so this is the difference, but the main concept is the same behind this concept of adding fragment to the activity, and behind this concept of adding mm fragments to the activities. In both these cases, all the fragments are residing in the same activity at that time. But in this case, for example, with the selection of these tabs, one of the fragments become visible, and with the selection of SMS, for example, SMS fragments gets visible. With the selection of the tab called call, the call fragments gets visible, and the other disappears, goes in the background. But in this case, all the fragments are appearing, but these fragments F1 and F2 are used to control the contents of this fragment 3. So this is a good example to really make the concept of the fragments clear. Now we will also now describe different states, and the process of a fragment initialization, and starting and stopping and pausing and destroying of a fragment by in the Android Studio. We can describe that in a pictorial way that will be more more clear than just like we did for the activities. So first of all, as in the case of activity, if we if for example, if the fragment is launched, launch, it is launched or added, then this onCreate callback is called. OnCreate is like, it's here you initialize your fragment, and all everything that you need to store in case in case the fragment goes to other states. And then from onCreate, for example, just like in the case of activity, we had this set content view function. We have this create view, which is actually setting all the contents or the layout or UI of the fragment, and it's returning the view in return. This is the return from this state. And you can also return view as null if your fragment has no view. And Then just like the activity from after set, so just like the activity after setting the UI, the fragment is started, and this start, for example, here is when the user actually sees the fragment, and then there is resume in case you have stopped or paused, then you got to come back to resume. And then resume, after the resuming, we have the pause state in the fragment. Pause state is, for example, when you are leaving the fragment, you're going to some other fragment, some other activity, then the fragment is paused. Pause does not mean that the fragment is killed. It means just paused, and the user might come back. So the what are the changes might be done? They are stored, and they are retained, and and the fragment is when the user wants to come back to the fragment, it just takes it back from the RAM. And then we have the pause state, just like the stop state, just like the activity, and after the stop we have the destroy state. After the activity destroy is when the fragment is actually being destroyed or killed, and then comes the fragment shut down. But I mean, there is also a fragment detach, because fragment is attached to an activity, and then it can go here. But we will describe the fragment detach, and we also have here a fragment, in fact, on attach, before the on create. But we will describe that after describing the main things that are kind of similar with the activity concept. So from the fragment stop, if the user clicks or calls the fragment again, it comes to the on create view. From the pause, it goes to the start or resume again. Sorry, to resume again, and that's the kind of very similar to the activity concept. So the attach and detach. Attach, for example, attaches the fragment to the UI on the Android activity, and the detach detaches the fragment from the Android UI. Remember that the detach and remove are not the same, uh, but we will see the details a little bit later.